In the last section, we described how the detection of receptive fields, defined by the presence of boundary elements around a shape on the retina, have a predominant recommendation strength in favour of placing a frequency modulation on the area within the boundary. So let's have a look at the consequences of that in more detail. Earlier in the course, we discussed how frequency modulation releases information for further processing. But let me briefly remind you of the mechanisms. One incoming action potential results in injection of postsynaptic potential into the target neuron. And this potential rises over a period of a couple of milliseconds and then decays away. So most of the effect is within a period of perhaps 5 milliseconds. And also, one spike doesn't have a strong enough effect to fire the target neuron, or even to push a branch into injecting potential deeper into the dendrite. There's a threshold, and I've conceptually illustrated that threshold in green, and that threshold has to be exceeded. If a neuron gets inputs, generally from a number of different neurons, that are all about 5 milliseconds apart, the effect of one input has largely decayed by the time the next input arrives, and it'll be very small by the time any later inputs arrive. So the total never gets to the threshold. But if the action potentials are bunched in time, so that in this example 4 of them arrive within less than 5 milliseconds of each other, then the combined effect of the 4 spikes is enough to cause the target neuron to fire. Now, in practice, the picture is a lot more complex. Synaptic strengths differ, and there's a complex integration process across the dendritic tree. But the principle remains. If inputs to a neuron arrive bunched within intervals of 5 milliseconds or so, they're much more likely to cause their target to fire. So let's suppose that this is a set of V1 neurons that target a V2 neuron, and we look at their action potentials over a period of 75 milliseconds. A 40 Hz gamma band frequency has a 225 millisecond interval from peak to peak, so we're looking at 3 complete cycles. Initially, the V1 action potentials are scattered more or less randomly in time. And if we look at time divided up into periods a little over 8 milliseconds, in other words, a third of the gamma band interval, there's only 3 or 4 spikes in any one period. So let's suppose that's too few to fire the V2 neuron. Now, let's focus attention on each third period, and let's call these periods time slots. If the TRN puts a 40 Hz modulation on the V1 neurons, the effect is to bunch the action potentials into the time slot around the peak of the modulation signal. Now, I'm assuming here that the total number of spikes doesn't change. I'll come back to that in a moment. In this situation, there's now almost double the number of spikes within every third 8 millisecond time slot, where they can reinforce each other. Now, hold on a minute. The TRN inputs are inhibitive. Why don't they cut off the outputs altogether, or at least reduce them considerably? Well, there's 2 answers to that. One is that the inhibition by the basal ganglia has been reduced, so the activity of the thalamus will increase, and that will increase the activity of the cortex. So the increased activity in the thalamocortical loop will compensate to some degree for the inhibitory inputs from the TRN. And the other answer is a bit more subtle and relates to the detailed way in which GABAergic synapses work, and I'll come to that in the next section.